and welcome to the first ever episode of the History Down Under podcast. I'm your host Travis, and together we will embark on a journey throughout Australia's weird, wild and wonderful history. Initially, when I began to consider creating a podcast, I wanted to start with Australia's involvement in the First World War, because I personally find this era of history fascinating. However, without the appropriate contextual information into pre-war Australia, one cannot fully appreciate Australia's involvement in the Great War. Therefore, today's episode will focus on the process by which Australia went from a collection of British colonies to becoming a formidable sovereign nation. Before delving into the birth of the Commonwealth of Australia through federalism, I would like to first clarify what federation actually means. To put it simply, federation is a union of partially self-governing states or provinces under a centralised government. This means that individual states within a federation have the power to pass laws on localised matters. However, when it comes to matters of national importance, such as defence, external affairs, immigration, taxation, postal services, and marital legislation, the jurisdiction then shifts from the state governments to the federal government. Some other notable countries that are considered federations are the United States of America, Canada, Brazil, Germany, Switzerland, Argentina, and India. Now that we have covered what federalism is, we can now discuss how it came about in Australia. Our story begins in the mid to late 1800s, when Australia was still made up of 6 self-governing British colonies. These colonies were New South Wales, South Australia, Victoria, Tasmania, Queensland, and Western Australia. The territories that we know and love today will appear a bit later in Australia's history. At this time, the colonies were basically different countries. The way I picture colonial Australia is similar to how I picture Europe, so a group of independent countries within one giant continent. Each of the 6 colonies had their own defence force, however these never grew beyond a few thousand men. They had their own governments, they had their own laws, they had their own taxes and import tariffs. In addition to this, intercolonial travel, which is the travelling from one colony to another, was extremely inconvenient during this period. Strangely enough, this is an era in which Australia was introduced to the steam trade, which made long-distance travel incredibly easy in Australia. However, it was not without its faults. Because each colony was independent and relatively isolated from one another, they each decided on their own unique rail gauges when constructing their tracks. The variation between the track sizes made it physically impossible for a train to cross certain borders within Australia. This meant that people would have to change trains before entering a colony. An example of this is when a passenger travelling from Perth to Brisbane was required to take 6 separate train journeys to reach their destination. It was not until 1995, so relatively recently, that all the tracks in Australia were replaced with one standardised gauge. One particular example of the stubbornness or rivalry amongst the colonies comes from a small border town called Wollongara, or Jennings depending on which colony you were in. Wollongara and Jennings is a town that is bifurcated by the New South Wales-Queensland border. There is literally a street that runs through the middle of this town called Border Street, and if you crossed this road prior to 1901, you would have had to have gone through customs. So if you had crossed the road to buy some sugar from the market, you would have to pay an import tax on your way home, because it was considered intercolonial trade. Furthermore, this town had an odd-looking train station, where the New South Wales tracks meet the narrower Queensland tracks. The building itself looks like 2 separate structures stuck together. The reason for this is that when the station was being constructed, New South Wales and Queensland both wanted the design of the building to match their individual architectural styles. So both colonies, unwilling to compromise, followed their original plans and met in the middle. As a result, the awning of the New South Wales side is much more angular and rigid, whereas the Queensland side is much more curved and flowing. This building still stands today and is one of the many examples of intercolonial stubbornness. On top of the already frustrating irregularity of the rail system, intercolonial travel was also made more difficult through the use of border security. At the border of each colony were customs officers, or customs houses as they were often called. Upon arrival to these customs offices, individuals had to be searched by officials who were looking for either alcohol, tobacco, sugar, flour, or basically anything that incurred some sort of import tax or tariff. There's a brilliant quote from a disgruntled passenger featured in the Argus, an old Australian newspaper dating from the 2nd of February 1887. And it goes, quote, "Sir, I write to you to protest against your barbarous custom house regulations. I and my wife were passengers by the express from Adelaide last Thursday, and on arrival in Melbourne we were subjected to the ignominy of having our boxes etc. searched and turned over before a crowd of railway porters and bystanders, although we had nothing but our wearing apparel and no dutiable goods. I consider it a disgrace to the colony of Victoria that its visitors from neighbouring colonies should be subjected to such treatment." Now, I don't know about you, but I'd be quite annoyed if someone was emptying my luggage in front of a platform of passengers and staff. In addition to the poor rail systems, the detested import tariffs and the invasive customs procedures, there were other factors in play that were also encouraging a united Australia. During the mid-1800s, there was also a growing fear in Australia for a potential mass Asian immigration or invasion. This was often referred to as the Yellow Peril, a term frequently used in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. This fear was largely due to numbers and military power. Australia at this time had a population of 3.5 million people, and a military that was completely unable to protect the continent from foreign invasion. Whereas China at this time had a population closer to 400 million people. Furthermore, Japan at this time had about 41 million people. Both of these countries had armies so large and well trained that if they so desired could take Australia with minimal resistance. Australia in essence was vulnerable. During this period there was also a rapid growth in Australian nationalism. By the end of the mid-1800s, most of the non-Indigenous population were born on the continent. Due to this, there was a shift in attitude and identity within the colonies. Most people started to consider themselves Australian rather than English, Scottish, Welsh or Irish. It is in this period that Australia begins to create patriotic songs and bush ballads, revelling the magnificence of Australia. One of the biggest leaps towards federation occurred on the 24th of October, 1889, in a small town in New South Wales. It is here that Sir Henry Parkes, the 5-time Premier of New South Wales, delivered an after-dinner speech that would change Australia forever. This speech is often referred to as the Tenterfield Oration, Tenterfield being the name of the town in which the speech was delivered. Following is a brief excerpt from the infamous speech. Quote, "To make myself as plain as possible, Australia has now a population of 3.5 million, and the American people numbered only between 3 and 4 million when they formed the great Commonwealth of the United States. The numbers are about the same. Surely what the Americans have done by war, Australians can bring about in peace. Believing as I do that it is essential to preserve the security and integrity of these colonies, then the whole of our forces should be amalgamated into one great federal army. We have now, from South Australia to Queensland, a stretch of about 2,000 miles of railways, and if the 4 colonies could combine to adopt a uniform gauge, it would be an immense advantage to the movements of troops. These are 2 great national questions which I lay before you. One great federal army and a nationwide uniform gauge railway." Unquote. While this speech was positively received by the majority of the Australian colonies, and including people such as Edmund Barton, the first Prime Minister of Australia, there were, however, still some cynics who were opposed to the idea of creating a united Australia. These were people who profited from the lack of competition due to the high import taxes between the colonies, people who were patriotic to their colony and disliked others, or people who believed that creating a federal government would be very expensive and would result in higher taxes for everyone. Additionally, the smaller colonies in terms of population, so Queensland, Tasmania and South Australia, were very cautious of federation because they believed that most of the federal decisions would be made to benefit the larger, more wealthier colonies such as Victoria or New South Wales. Queensland also opposed the idea of federation, as they thought that the tougher immigration laws imposed by the federal government would hinder their large sugarcane industry, which relied on Kanaka or Pacific Islander workers, However, the push for federation was far greater than the resistance. The British colonies in Australia were not the only ones who displayed a growing interest in the concept of federation. The first ever National Australasian Convention was conducted in March through to April in 1891, in which delegates from each of the colonies and New Zealand had met up to develop a draft constitution which aimed to unite the colonies and create a new federal level of government. However, after the initial draft was written, New Zealand withdrew their involvement in the campaign for federation. In June 1898, referendums were held in New South Wales, Victoria, South Australia and Tasmania. This made Australia the first nation to take a proposed constitution to the people for approval. The referendum was passed in Victoria, South Australia and Tasmania. However, New South Wales did not meet the minimum number of votes for it to agree or disagree. Queensland and Western Australia did not hold referendums as they were overly cautious of the whole concept. The results of the first referendum were displeasing. However, after some modifications to the constitution, a second referendum was held in 1899 in the colonies of Victoria, South Australia, New South Wales, Tasmania, and this time Queensland. Each of the colonies voted yes to federation, and Queensland only by the narrowest of margins. Western Australia, the most isolated of all the colonies, refused to take part again. Subsequently, on the 9th of July 1900, the Act to constitute the Commonwealth of Australia was passed in the British Parliament. 3 weeks after the Constitution became law in Britain, Western Australia realised that the other colonies would federate regardless if it joined or not. Promptly, they had a change of heart and Western Australia finally held a referendum, the result of which was a 2-to-1 vote in favour of joining. This Act stated, quote, "It shall be lawful for the Queen, with the advice of the Privy Council, to declare by proclamation, on and after the day therein appointed, not being later than 1 year after the passing of this Act, the people of New South Wales, Victoria, South Australia, Queensland and Tasmania, and also, if Her Majesty is satisfied, that the people of Western Australia have agreed thereto, shall be united in a federal commonwealth under the name Commonwealth of Australia." Unquote. True to their word, less than 1 year after the passing of the Act, on the 1st of January 1901, the Commonwealth of Australia was inaugurated. On this day, Australians woke up to a new year, but also to a new nation. At Centenary Park in Sydney, approximately 500,000 excited Australians gathered in anticipation for the Federation Parade to celebrate the newfound unity between the colonies. Edmund Barton, the long-time advocate for federation, was sworn in as Australia's first Prime Minister. The sources state that people amassed in the streets, crammed onto balconies, hung out of windows and perched on rooftops to celebrate the inauguration of the Commonwealth. The streets were lined with flags and buntings, and 10 specially constructed Federation arches were placed along the parade route. 10,000 people participated in the parade march, including military troops, mounted police, marching bands, firefighters, numerous horse-drawn floats, and others. These celebrations continued for another 8 days, which consisted of concerts, military demonstrations, sports carnivals, firework displays, special church services, debates, and even a reenactment of Captain Cook's landing at Botany Bay. An excerpt from the New South Wales Sydney Morning Herald a day after the inauguration highlights the significance of what had just occurred. Quote, "The leaders of the Commonwealth assisted in the performance of an act which joins hitherto separated provinces of this continent together in a federation which must be indissoluble. The rivalry of the colonies and the conflicting aims of their respective politicians were put aside yesterday. Henceforth these provinces will no longer be known as colonies, but as states. The political leaders of the future must be statesmen of the Commonwealth, and not merely local politicians. Their aims must be national, and their outlook must be broad enough and generous enough to take in the vast possibilities and, as we hope, the vast destinies of the Commonwealth." And so, the Commonwealth of Australia was born.